Chapter 10 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. 5. Rise of Gentile Christianity in Antioch. It was probably a year or two before the Herodian persecution that the attention of the Church in Jerusalem was called to the progress of the faith in Syrian Antioch. The events which had occurred there were in fact the opening of a new chapter in the history of the religion of Jesus. In narrating them, we must go back to the dispersion which followed the death of Stephen. Some of the refugees fled northwards to Phoenicia and the island of Cyprus, which lay about 50 miles off the Phoenician coast, and came finally to the great metropolis of Syria, Antioch, on the Orontes. Like the other refugees, they preached as they journeyed, but to Jews only. Some of them, Jews from Cyprus and Cyrene, and therefore perhaps less narrowed than others by Jewish prejudices, began preaching in Antioch to Gentiles. Footnote: whether Hellenas or Hellenistas be the right reading in Acts chapter 11 verse 20, there can be no doubt that the work was among the non-Jewish population. End footnote. This met with much success. A community of believers arose in the Syrian metropolis, composed mainly of uncircumcised foreigners, with whom the Jewish disciples lived on terms of equality. The incident shows that, quite independently of the divine preparation of Paul and of the Mother Church for work among the Gentiles, there was in some quarters a tendency in the same direction, traceable to the spirit of the faith itself. It was in fact the inevitable issue of the offer of salvation by faith which had been proclaimed from the beginning, and of the widening sympathies engendered by the expansion. The rise of Gentile Christianity in Antioch was, however, specially momentous because of the character and position of that city. The Antiochian church was fitted to be a new centre for the diffusion of the faith. From it, the message about Jesus, separated from Jewish complications, could best issue into the empire. The third city of the empire, outranked in size only by Rome and Alexandria, crowded with a mixed population, and connected commercially with both East and West, Antioch was the most important place for the faith, advancing from Jerusalem, to occupy. From it, the new religion would be carried by report in every direction. It lay just beyond the confines of Palestine, and thus was not so far from the original centre as to lose touch with the Mother Church. At the same time, it was the door from Palestine to the Greco-Roman world. No place was so well suited to be a base of operations for the progress of Christianity into the empire. It was surely not accidental that these unknown refugees were led to begin their quiet but portentous mission in Antioch. We cannot say how soon after Stephen's death this work began, nor how long it continued before attracting the attention of the church in Jerusalem. The report, however, evidently reached the latter shortly before the Herodian persecution. Forthwith, Barnabas was sent to examine into it. The Jerusalem church thus assumed authority over the churches founded by the refugees. The desire for examination into the report implies likewise a sense of its novelty and of its doubtful character from the strict Jewish point of view. Yet the selection of Barnabas indicates the absence of hostility to the new movement. Being himself a Cypriot, he was naturally chosen to investigate a work which had in part originated with his fellow countrymen. He was also a man of liberal mind and hospitable to new developments of the cause, as had been shown by his reception of the converted Paul. At the same time, he was of high repute among the brethren in Jerusalem. He was thus fitted to appreciate the new movement, if it was a genuine work of the Spirit of Jesus, and to mediate, if necessary, between it and the older church. His mission illustrates, therefore, the joy of the Mother Church over the expansion of the faith, her willingness to recognize it if genuine, and yet, no doubt, the reluctance of most of the brethren in Jerusalem to go themselves directly to the Gentiles. That none of the apostles was sent may have been due to their absence, or to the feeling that, for the reasons stated, Barnabas was best qualified to appreciate the situation, or possibly because, this being the action, not of the apostles but of the church, Acts chapter 11 verse 22, one of the local officials, such as Barnabas doubtless was deemed the appropriate representative. The choice certainly proved a wise one. Barnabas recognized the genuinely Christian character of the Gentile converts. With much large-mindedness, he made no attempt to exact conformity to the Jewish law. Nay more, he departed at once to Tarsus, and brought Paul from thence to Antioch, and the two men laboured together for a year in the new sphere with greater results than before. Acts chapter 11 verses 25 and 26. All this is very significant. It seems probable that Barnabas was acquainted with Paul's commission to the Gentiles, that he sympathized with it, and that he saw in Antioch the divinely prepared opportunity for it. It is clear, too, that neither of them thought for a moment that Gentile believers would be bound by the Jewish laws. That demand had not yet been raised within the church. Thus, the first Gentile church known to history was established in harmonious relations with the mother church, and in this new field Barnabas and Paul began the work of expansion outside of the limits of Judaism, which they were to carry on, together or separately, for many years. Two other interesting facts are noted by Luke in connection with the young church at Antioch, Acts chapter 11 verses 26 to 30. One is that here the name Christian was first applied to the followers of Jesus. It must have originated with the Gentiles, for obviously the Jews would not have given it to them. It implies also that they were no longer considered a Jewish sect, for the term distinguishes them from the Jews. The disciples had called themselves believers, Acts chapter 11 verse 24. Compare 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 7, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 10. Or brethren, Acts chapter 1 verse 15, chapter 9 verse 30, and chapter 10 verse 23. Or those of the way, Acts chapter 11 verse 2, compare chapter 19 verse 9 and chapter 22 verse 4. Or simply disciples, Acts chapter 6 verses 1, 2 and 7, and chapter 9 verses 10, 19, 26 and so on. Yet the title Christian, while given them by others, would naturally be a welcome one, and this the more as their own consciousness of separation from Judaism advanced. There was nothing necessarily derisive in it. It speedily became their common title among the Gentiles. The Jews indeed still called them Nazarenes, Acts chapter 24 verse 5. Yet even Agrippa, Acts chapter 26 verse 28, used the term Christian, doubtless because of his acquaintance with its use elsewhere. Tacitus testifies that before Nero's persecution, this was their common name in Rome, Annales chapter 15 verse 44. Peter, 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 16, intimates that the appellation was current in Asia Minor. The term, moreover, is not of Latin, but of Greek origin. Denominatives of this form were frequent among the Greeks, especially among the Greek-speaking population of the East. Lipsius, über den Ursprung und früheren Gebrauch des Christennamens. The title thus naturally originated in Antioch under the circumstances which Luke describes, and marks the first appearance of the faith among the Gentiles as a non-Judaic religion. The other fact noted by Luke is that prophets from Jerusalem came to Antioch. This remark introduces us to a class of persons of whom frequent mention is made in apostolic literature. Acts chapter 13 verse 1, chapter 15 verse 32, chapter 22 verse 10, 1 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 28 and 29, chapter 14, verses 29, 32, and 37, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 4, verse 11, Revelations chapter 10, verse 7, chapter 11, verse 18, chapter 16, verse 6, chapter 18, verses 20 and 24, chapter 22, verses 6 and 9. The prophet was not an ordinary church official. Anyone from an apostle, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2, chapter 14, verse 6, and Revelations chapter 1, verse 3, to a private member, Acts chapter 21, verse 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, Romans chapter 12, verse 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 29, might possess the gift. Prophecy was the chief of those endowments which the Spirit, after Pentecost, bestowed upon the Church as the seal of the Lord's triumph and the earnest of his people's salvation. The New Testament conception of a prophet is precisely that of the Old Testament. He was one whom God made the organ for the communication of truth to the Church, one who spoke directly from God and whose words were the words of God. The gift might be temporary or permanent. It might operate with or without the use of rational means for the acquisition of truth by the prophet. The truth communicated might be didactic or predictive or even historical. Compare 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. The existence, therefore, of prophets in the Apostolic Church testifies to the belief that it was an age of revelation. Besides having the historic teaching of Jesus, the disciples believed that God was continually communicating truth to them. This prophetic ministry belonged to the apostles, but, as has been said, was not confined to them, so that on the foundation of the apostles and prophets was the church held to be established. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. With other gifts of the Spirit, it made the worship of the disciples partake largely of the character of a Spirit-led and voluntary service. It thus checked for a time the development of official teachers in the congregation. We shall find later the value of regular official teachers emphasized. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 28, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And from the beginning, the instruction of converts was never wanting. Acts chapter 2, verse 42, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 12, Galatians chapter 6, verse 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 28, Romans chapter 12, verse 7. The utterances of prophecy were moreover to be tested by the teaching already given by the apostles. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 and 14, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 37, 1 John chapter 4, verses 2 and 6. But the prophets were the living evidence of the continuance of the prophetic office of Messiah, by whose Spirit they spake. The beliefs of the disciples, resting on this basis, were therefore to them authoritative revelations. This belief in living prophecy, united with belief in apostolic authority, created among the Christians the conviction that a new revelation was being made to them in addition to, though including, the teaching and work of Jesus, and finally laid the ground for a belief in an inspired Christian literature corresponding to the Old Testament, which we find expressed in the Apostolic Age itself. For example, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 3, verse 14, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 27, 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 1, 2, and 16, 1 John chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, Revelations chapter 1, verses 3 and 11, and chapter 12, verses 18 and 19. In the teaching of the apostles, about AD 100, we still read of prophets as itinerant preachers, and we shall not appreciate properly the consciousness of the apostolic Christians if we omit their faith in a present revelation which was being communicated to them by inspired men. Luke's reference to the prophets who came from Jerusalem to Antioch indicates the cordial relations which existed between the old and the new communities. This soon found further expression. One of the prophets, Agabus by name, doubtless in one of the public services of the church, predicted that a great famine was about to come on the whole empire. Acts chapter 11, verse 28. Probably this prediction formed part of an inspired description of the woes which would fall on the world, and especially on the Jews, before Messiah's return. Compare Matthew chapter 24, verse 7, Revelations chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. At any rate, the prediction of a famine was specific. Luke notes that this happened during the reign of Claudius. That this was so in Judea is confirmed by Josephus, Antiquities, chapter 22.5 and 5.2, who calls it the Great Famine. He locates it during the procuratorships of Fadus, AD 44 to 46, and Tiberius Alexander, AD 46 to 48? We know also of other famines under Claudius: Dio Cassius, 60:11, Tacitus, Annals, 12:43, Suetonius Claudius, 18. Two of these were felt at Rome, which implies that they raged in the provinces whence the food supply of the capital was drawn. Eusebius, Chronicles 1:79, also refers to one in Greece. Luke's remark therefore is quite justified, but the important fact is the action taken by the Antiochian Christians. They expected, as probably Agabus had declared, that the famine would come soon, so they began at once to raise a fund for the relief of the brethren in Judea. Acts chapter 11, verse 29. This implies that most of the Judean disciples were known to be poor. Compare Galatians chapter 2, verse 10. And also that the Antiochians recognized their special obligation to the mother church. The two churches were thus united in love and mutual helpfulness, and the two men to whose labours the church at Antioch owed the most were chosen as the bearers of their gift. The aid was carried to the elders of Jerusalem by Barnabas and Paul. Acts chapter 11, verse 30. This mission of Barnabas and Paul has, however, occasioned difficulty because of the fact that Paul does not mention it in the first chapter of Galatians. It is thought by many that his argument required him to mention every visit he had made to Jerusalem since his conversion. Hence, Luke's account in this place has been deemed unhistorical. Others have sought to identify this visit with that described in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, when also Barnabas accompanied Paul. Ramsay, St. Paul the Traveller, page 55. But to the latter view there are insuperable objections. The visit of Galatians chapter 2 had for its chief object the declaration of the gospel which Paul preached among the Gentiles, and the determination of the attitude of the mother church toward Gentile converts. Paul's language implies that the recognition of uncircumcised believers was then a burning question. He had also private interviews with James, Peter, and John on the subject of work among the Gentiles. The apostle's object is to point out that harmony with his views and the cordial recognition of his mission prevailed. Only incidentally does he mention the desires of the leaders of the Jerusalem church that he should remember the poor. Galatians chapter 2, verse 10. This account does not correspond at all with the cordial relations which we have found existing between the churches of Jerusalem and Antioch when the visit with the gifts was made, nor with the entire absence of the question of circumcision at that time. The request that he should remember the poor is also much more natural if on a previous occasion he had done so, than on the assumption that it was made without justification in his former life. Still further, this identification supposes that the important visit recorded in Acts chapter 15 is not mentioned at all in the epistle, although it had, on any reasonable view of the date of the writing, certainly occurred. We must conclude, therefore, that Paul does not mention the visit with the gifts. This, however, need not throw doubt on its occurrence. His argument, in reality, required him only to mention those occasions on which he had met the older apostles. Compare Galatians chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. It is worthy of note that in Acts he is said merely to have been sent to the elders of the Jerusalem church. The visit was doubtless brief, for the gifts, being probably in the form of money, were soon turned over to the elders. There is no sufficient reason to assume that Paul and Barnabas remained to distribute them. If also Acts chapter 11 verse 30 and chapter 12 verse 24, when their place in Luke's narrative is observed, imply, as some believe, that the visit occurred in the very year of the Herodian persecution, AD 44. Another reason is suggested for its brevity, and for the improbability that the visitors met any of the apostles. So Paul and Barnabas hastened back to their field of labour. Luke only adds, in anticipation of his further narrative, that they took with them to Antioch the cousin, Colossians chapter 4 verse 10, Revised Version, of Barnabas, John, whose surname was Mark. Acts chapter 12 verse 25. End of chapter 10.